Summer, 1456. The Sultan known as the Conqueror brings the world's greatest army and thunderous cannon to the gates of a battered city. Inside those crumbling walls, hope is all but gone. A forgotten general rallies a ragtag band of peasants, priests, and mercenaries, outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by their king. Outside, 100,000 Ottoman soldiers prepare to erase Belgrade from the map. But when the first cannonballs crash through stone, something extraordinary happens. The defenders refuse to break. Faith clashes with firepower, and desperation turns into defiance. This is not just a siege. This is the moment a handful of heroes stood against an empire and changed the course of history. To understand just how impossible this victory was, you first have to understand the man marching on Belgrade. This wasn't just any sultan. This was Mehmed II. And just 3 years earlier, in 1453, he had done what no one thought could be done. At only 21 years old, he had conquered Constantinople. The city had stood for over 1,000 years, its legendary walls turning back dozens of sieges. It was the heart of the old Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, and a bastion of Christendom. Mehmed broke it, and he did it with strategic genius and a terrifying new form of warfare. Massive, powerful cannons that could turn stone walls into dust. With Constantinople's fall, a shockwave of fear shot across Europe. Mehmed was no longer just a sultan. He was Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Conqueror. And his ambition had no limits. He saw himself as the heir to the Roman Caesars, destined to build a new world empire from the city he'd just taken. But to push west, to march on the capitals of Europe, he first needed to secure his path. And that path ran straight through one critical fortress, Belgrade. Sitting at the junction of the mighty Danube and Sava rivers, Belgrade was more than a city. It was a gate. It was the key to the Kingdom of Hungary and the vast plains of Central Europe. For decades, it had stood as the last major Christian stronghold, blocking the Ottoman advance. Mehmed knew that to conquer the West, he had to take Belgrade first, and he was bringing the entire force of his empire to do it. His army was a spectacle of modern military power. While early accounts exaggerated its size, modern historians place it between 60,000 and 70,000 men. This was a professional, standing army, the most advanced of its time. At its core were the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps raised from childhood to be perfect soldiers, fanatically loyal, brutally effective, and the terror of every battlefield they set foot on. They were backed by Sipahi cavalry and a massive supply train. And then there were the cannons. Mehmed brought an artillery train of around 300 pieces. Among them were several enormous siege guns, the same type that had shattered the walls of Constantinople. One legend even claims some of these cannons were cast from the melted-down church bells of the fallen city, a story that shows the sheer terror he inspired. As this immense force moved north, its target was no secret. The jaws of the wolf were closing on Belgrade, and all of Europe held its breath, praying for a miracle. They had no idea they were about to get one. While Mehmed marched with the unified power of an empire, the Kingdom of Hungary was falling apart. It was a kingdom paralyzed by fear and political squabbling. The nobles bickered among themselves, refusing to fund a national defense. The young king was tangled up in his own political fights, unable to rally the country against the coming storm. It seemed no one was willing or able to stand in the Sultan's way. No one, that is, except for two men. Two men who couldn't have been more different, but who were united by a fierce will to defend their world. The first was John Hunyadi. If anyone in Europe understood the threat Mehmed posed, it was him. Hunyadi was a Hungarian nobleman, a battle-hardened warlord, and the most famous Ottoman fighter of his generation. For decades, he had fought the Turks across the Balkans, earning a fearsome reputation as a brilliant and relentless commander. He knew their tactics, he knew their strength, and he knew Belgrade was the final line of defense. But Hunyadi had a problem. He was a general without an army. The Hungarian nobles had refused to provide the money for a relief force, leaving Hunyadi to raise one at his own expense. All he had was a small corps of about 10,000 loyal mercenaries and his own knights. Seasoned veterans for sure, but a tiny force to face Mehmed's legions. The second man wasn't a warrior. He was a priest. Giovanni da Capistrano, or John of Capistrano, was a 70-year-old Franciscan friar from Italy. Sent by the Pope to preach against heresy, his mission changed when he saw the existential threat of Mehmed's invasion. He was frail and old, but he had a fire and charisma that could move mountains. While the nobles of Hungary hesitated, Capistrano took his appeal straight to the people. He traveled the countryside, a stark figure whose fiery sermons, delivered in Latin that many couldn't even understand, somehow lit a fire in the hearts of the common folk. He preached a crusade not of kings and knights, but of the faithful. He called on peasants, farmers, blacksmiths, and students to pick up whatever weapons they could find and march to save Christendom. And so, the most unlikely of alliances was born. On one side, John Hunyadi, the pragmatic, battle-scarred general, desperately trying to assemble a professional force with his own money. On the other, John of Capistrano, the zealous servant of God who believed faith alone could build an army strong enough to beat the world's greatest power. Together, they were the only hope for Belgrade, a hope that rested on a few professional soldiers and a tidal wave of righteous fury. Capistrano's call to arms got a response that nobody, especially not the Hungarian nobility, saw coming. From villages and towns all across southern Hungary, the people came. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers with scythes and flails, blacksmiths with hammers, and students with nothing more than courage. They were poorly equipped, completely untrained in warfare, and held together by nothing more than the words of an old priest and a burning desire to defend their homes. They flocked to Hunyadi's banner, swelling his forces with a massive, undisciplined host of crusaders. For Hunyadi, the professional soldier, this was both a blessing and a nightmare. He desperately needed the men, but what he saw in front of him was a mob, not an army. How could peasants with farm tools stand against the disciplined charge of the Janissaries? How could their faith possibly hold up against Mehmed's cannons? The tension was obvious. Hunyadi and Capistrano commanded their forces separately. The general and the priest united in purpose, but divided in method. Hunyadi and his professional corps of mercenaries and knights focused on military strategy. Capistrano, meanwhile, was the spiritual heart of the camp, holding mass and stoking the crusading zeal of his followers. He had forged them into an army of the faithful, and while they didn't have armor or training, they didn't lack conviction. They believed they were fighting a holy war, and in that belief, they were fearless. As Mehmed's army arrived and the siege began in early July 1456, this strange mixed force was all that stood in its way. Inside the fortress of Belgrade, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Mihaly Szilágyi, commanded a small garrison of only 5,000 to 7,000 men. Outside the city, camped along the Danube, was this unlikely alliance. Hunyadi's small professional army and Capistrano's enormous chaotic crusader host. Together, their total force numbered between 25,000 and 30,000 men. They would have to face the storm together. In the first days of July, the Ottoman army arrived. An Ottoman chronicler described their white tents stretching across the plains like a field of snow. The Danube River, the city's lifeline, was choked by an Ottoman fleet of around 200 ships, forming a blockade to stop any relief from reaching the city. On land, Mehmed's engineers began digging siege lines, and his cannons were moved into position. On July 4th, the bombardment began. For weeks, a relentless thunder echoed across the plains as the giant cannons pounded the walls of Belgrade. These were the superweapons of their day, hurling massive stone balls that smashed the medieval fortifications. The defenders inside worked tirelessly, patching the damage at night with whatever they could find, but it was a losing battle. The outer walls started to crumble just as they had at Constantinople. The psychological pressure was immense. The noise was deafening, a constant reminder of the destruction that was coming. Hunyadi knew he couldn't just wait it out. His first critical goal was to break the naval blockade on the Danube. Without access to the city, he couldn't reinforce the garrison. On July 14th, he launched a desperate, brilliant attack. His own makeshift fleet of smaller, faster ships charged directly at the Ottoman fleet. In a brutal, 5-hour battle, they shattered the Ottoman blockade, sinking several galleys and capturing dozens of smaller ships. The way to Belgrade was open. Hunyadi rushed reinforcements and supplies to the exhausted garrison, a crucial early victory that boosted morale. But Mehmed was not deterred. The loss of his fleet was an annoyance, but his real power was in his cannons and his janissaries. The bombardment continued, growing even more intense. Finally, after weeks of relentless pounding, the outer walls were breached in several places. The city was exposed. On the evening of July 21st, Mehmed ordered the final, all-out assault. Under the cover of darkness, the elite janissaries flooded into the city through the rubble-filled breaches. They poured into the lower town and fierce, desperate fighting broke out in the streets. The outnumbered defenders were pushed back, fighting for every inch of ground. The Ottomans pressed their attack, moving toward the main fortress of the upper town. It looked like the end had finally come. A Turkish soldier even managed to plant the Sultan's standard on top of a bastion, a sign that the city was about to fall. In the chaos of the all-night assault, with janissaries swarming the city, John Hunyadi made a brilliant tactical move. He ordered his men to throw oil-soaked wood and other flammable materials into the narrow streets and set them on fire. A wall of fire erupted, separating the thousands of janissaries who had already broken through from the rest of the army trying to follow. The elite troops were trapped, cut off from reinforcements, and forced into a bloody house-to-house fight. The defenders fought with incredible ferocity. In a now famous legend of heroism, a Hungarian soldier named Titus Dugovic is said to have grabbed the Turk who planted the Sultan's flag on the rampart and pulled them both off the wall to their deaths, preventing the symbol of defeat from demoralizing the defenders. The Ottoman assault slowed and was eventually thrown back with huge losses. The morning of July 22nd rose on a scene of carnage and exhaustion. The city had held, but just barely. Hunyadi gave strict orders. No one was to leave the fortress. They had to repair the walls and get ready for the next attack. He knew his peasant army was no match for the Ottomans in an open field. But what happened next wasn't part of any general's plan. It was a moment of spontaneous, holy madness. A few of Capistrano's crusaders, positioned near the Ottoman lines, started sneaking out to harass the enemy soldiers. The Ottoman cavalry tried to scatter them, but the peasants, armed with their farm tools and religious fire, refused to back down. Seeing this, more crusaders joined them, then more. What started as a small skirmish quickly exploded into a full-scale, unauthorized charge. John of Capistrano, seeing his flock charging straight into the teeth of the Ottoman army, at first tried to order them back. But seeing their unstoppable zeal, he had a change of heart. He ran to the front of the disorganized mob, held a large crucifix high in the air, and led them forward, his voice roaring, "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the end." It was a suicidal charge, an act of pure, irrational faith, and it changed history. Watching from the fortress walls, Hunyadi was horrified. His entire strategy was coming apart. But as he saw the peasant charge sow confusion and panic in the Ottoman lines, he realized this was his one and only chance. He couldn't let their sacrifice be for nothing. Making the decision of a lifetime, he unleashed his own force. His elite heavy cavalry thundered out of the city in a perfectly timed, disciplined charge, smashing into the Ottoman flank and driving straight for the one target that could win the battle: the Ottoman cannon positions. The Ottoman army was caught completely by surprise. In front of them was a screaming, unstoppable wave of peasants led by a priest. On their flank, they were being torn apart by some of the best heavy cavalry in Europe. The Crusaders stormed the Ottoman camp. Hunyadi's knights captured the massive siege cannons and, in a stunning turn of events, turned them on their former masters, firing into the heart of the Ottoman camp and the Sultan's own bodyguard. The invincible army collapsed into chaos. Panic set in and soldiers began to flee. Even Sultan Mehmed II, fighting to rally his men, was wounded in the thigh. The Conqueror, the man who had broken Constantinople, was defeated. His army was routed, the battle was won. Under the cover of darkness, the shattered remains of the great army retreated in a hurry, leaving behind their camp and their powerful cannons. The Sultan, upon regaining consciousness and learning the full scale of the disaster, was said to have been barely stopped from taking his own life. The victory at Belgrade was absolute, a military upset of incredible proportions. But the victory came at a terrible price. In the aftermath of the siege, with thousands of bodies lying under the summer sun, plague broke out in the Hungarian camp. The disease would claim the lives of the battle's two greatest heroes. John Hunyadi, the brilliant general who had engineered the defense, died just 3 weeks after his triumph. A few months later, John of Capistrano, the warrior priest whose faith had inspired an army, also died. They were heroes who didn't live to see the peace they had won. Yet their legacy was secure. The incredible victory at Belgrade halted the Ottoman advance into Hungary for the next 70 years. It stabilized the frontiers of Christendom and became a symbol of hope across the continent, proving that the conqueror was not invincible. The news was met with pure joy in Rome. Before the battle, Pope Calixtus III had ordered the bells of every church in Europe to be rung every day at noon, calling for prayers for Belgrade's defenders. When news of the victory arrived, the ringing of the noon bell was transformed from a plea for help into a celebration of triumph. And so a tradition was born. The noon bell, which still rings in many Catholic and Old Protestant churches to this day, is a direct living echo of that desperate, glorious summer day in 1456. It's a reminder, ringing out over 500 years later, of how a veteran general, a fiery priest, and an army of farmers, united by faith and courage, faced down an empire and achieved one of the greatest military upsets in history. The Siege of Belgrade is a powerful story of how leadership, faith, and the unbelievable courage of ordinary people can overcome impossible odds. It proves that history isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest hearts. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next. Thank you for watching,